Hi, everybody. This is Lillian Monjo. I'm going to be hosting this panel today. Thank you all for coming. It looks like we've got a bunch of people on already and are still waiting for a few more people to register, but we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, my name's Lillian Monjo. I work for the Hechinger Report covering California, and I also write for Education Week as one of the bloggers for early years. So there's going to be a lot of early education stuff in this upcoming webinar, and that's one of the reasons I'm here, so hopefully I can help you guys out a little bit. Let me introduce our panelists, and then we'll have a few more details, and then we'll get started. So our first panelist is Chris Swanson. He is the Vice President of Editorial Projects in Education the Vice President of Editorial Projects in Education, which is the group that publishes EdWeek, as many of you already know. He was previously the director of the EdWeek Research Center, and he is an expert on a lot of things if you read his bio, but high school dropouts, education policy and research, education innovation and accountability, and a long list of other things that you can read about on his website. Holly Yedick is our other guest. She's the director of the EdWeek Research Center now. She covered education for 11 years in Florida, Alabama, and Colorado. She was a Knight Wallace Foundation journalist. She also has a PhD in which she did her study on how journalists make decisions about covering education, which I think is really interesting. So those are our two panelists. They're going to be giving a presentation on this year's Quality Counts. A couple details for you all attendees. If you have questions, please enter them as you think of them. They're going to be funneled directly to me, and at our question period, I'll go through and ask as many of them as we can get to. Please, please, please write your name and affiliation with your question. If we don't have a name and affiliation with the question, we can't ask it. So write your question as you think of it. It will come through on the question, like during the time for questions set aside after the presentation. And please don't forget your name and your affiliation. Also, if you haven't seen it yet, you all should have received a message directly from Education Week with the embargoed report. So if you want to, be looking along on your own state or on your own information while the presentation is happening, you can click through to that on your computer and do that now. I'd like to say any questions, but there's no good way of getting you to ask that. So we're just going to go right on now to the presentation. I believe Chris will be starting. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, so Chris will be starting, and then Holly will come in.
Thanks for the introduction, Lillian. I know the title is a bit of a mouthful, but kind of folks will know Education Week, of course, and EPD is the parent organization. Hopefully you've all got the information on the report already, and I'll remind us all, and I know you've had to probably sign, do a sign-in. The report is still under embargo until 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time tomorrow, so just after midnight. And at the bottom of the slide there, in case you don't have the materials handy, you'll see the link to the reports, www.edweek.org/go/QC15, and that's where you'll find all the information about the report itself, and state-specific resources and other things that we will, kind of talk about as we go along. So it's always a kind of fun time of year to, kind of get out and talk about our work. Quality Counts, and some of you may know this, or it's occurred to you already. Quality Counts comes right at the beginning of January every year. It is a report that, sometimes in the office we think is intended to, disturb our holidays, but it's actually comes at the beginning of the year for a particular purpose. And specifically, this is a time of year where we turn to state policy. State of the States addresses will be coming soon, and Quality Counts is a report that has really put a spotlight on state policy now for 19 years, kind of wants to get out and be part of that conversation at this critical time of year. So it's always a fun time as the new year comes around for us. So this year's report, if you know Quality Counts, you'll know that every year it takes on a different theme. This year's focus is early childhood education. It's a great topic. It's an issue that we do devote some attention to in Education Week, but since our primary focus is the K-12 system, we don't spend a whole lot of time on the pre-K kind of piece of the education continuum and a person's education career. And so it's a really nice opportunity to be able to kind of, put a tight focus on it, go into some depth on some key issues. And it is a really interesting topic, I think, especially for people who work more kind of squarely within the K-12 system. I know I personally have been part of meetings over the years in which I am, the K-12 representative, and it's mostly a meeting of kind of early childhood or childhood development specialists. And it's very interesting to me because the language we use to kind of talk about some similar things in K-12 versus early childhood education is quite different. And I think that's also something you see when you look at the policy environment, when you look at the key players, you look at the balance between public and private sector programs. It's very different. And as we know, some of the most important stages within a student's kind of education lifetime come at those transition points between institutions, whether it's early childhood to K-12, K-12 to higher education. Those are really critical, but they're also very complicated because what you really need to do to get things working on all cylinders is to get a couple systems that don't necessarily work well together or even communicate with one another to really start coordinating in a more systematic way. And that's where you can really see the potential to unlock what's going on in the education system. So we like this topic. Let's just leave it at that. Early childhood is also interesting kind of right now issue because it's one of those, even as we come through a year where we've seen education issues become increasingly politicized. And that's, I think in education we're a little bit fortunate because historically education issues have transcended a lot of party, not all, but, more partisan politics than you tend to see in some other domestic policy issues. But education has become more politicized than it had been before. We have seen this around some of the kind of pushback to the Common Core. If you have been kind of following the kind of possible presidential run for Governor Jeb Bush, his education involvement and the role of his foundation has come up. And so I think we're seeing some, kind of increasing pull of education into the political world. It's not a good thing, it's not a bad thing, it's just kind of, it looks like a reality right now. But even, taking that into account, early childhood is an area where there is a lot of consensus about the importance and value of early childhood programs. But even if there's consensus that it's important, that's kind of the starting point. You'll see that as a tagline in the report at one point. There are a lot of debates among people who value kind of early childhood development and educational programs as to exactly how you do it, how you fund it, how, if at all, these programs should be targeted. So it's an interesting area. There's a lot of consensus, and there's a lot of hard work and hard thinking that needs to be done as we move forward. You are all journalists, and so I probably don't need to encourage you to actually look at the journalism in the report. A lot of people who follow Quality Counts and have over the years know it primarily as a report card of the states and the nation on education, historically education policy, and now more focused on performance and kind of key conditions for success. So, and we will talk about that actually for the bulk of the conversation today, but I'll just, kind of tee up a couple of the themes you'll see examined in the journalism in the report this year, and I've kind of already started to highlight some of those. Early childhood education is not all that different than K-12 to the extent that some of what happens in the K-12 system, especially related to standards and accountability pressures, does kind of push its way down into early childhood years. We've seen that in some ways with kind of Head Start and the way that's being viewed more as an academic preparation program versus its kind of historical focus on kind of whole child development. And there's other examples of that when you start to look at things like kind of standards in the Common Core and kind of focus on early academic preparation to get students on an effective pathway toward finishing high school and moving on into a kind of post-secondary environment. There's a lot of policy debates surrounding early childhood programs. Some of it deals with funding. Again, some of it deals kind of with focus and what the identity of these programs are. Are they primarily academic? Are they primarily developmental? Are they some combination of the two? There's been a lot of research over the years, and it's early childhood is one of those areas where there are a handful, and we probably all know what they are: peri, preschool, ambidextrarian, and a couple others, some early kind of very rigorous studies of model programs that have informed over the years and actually decades the way we think about especially the potential of early childhood educational programs, and it's also the context in which we nest the current versions of Head Start and other sorts of programs. But we're undergoing, that's the history, but we're actually undergoing a really interesting renaissance right now in the research evidence related to early childhood. There's a lot of great brain science that's going on now, the way kind of young children learn, and kind of exactly how that happens and how it is and it's not like the way older kids learn, much less the way adults think and learn. So it's a really interesting time to be following that particular line of research and see, great insight on that in the report. And just like anybody else, even our youngest students, before they get to school, are inundated with technology often in their daily lives. In the K-12 world, we talk a lot about the way in which students at home and outside of school are in a very technology-rich environment. And in some ways, although I think schools are catching up, in some ways schools are kind of behind the curve if you look at something like access and engagement with consumer technology and media. And our youngest students are not immune to that. There's technology in the classroom, there's technology in their lives, and you'll see a great piece in the report that kind of gets into kind of what's happening at the preschool level and some examples of kind of how preschools and elementary schools in a particular district of Pennsylvania are approaching these issues. So again, encourage you to take a look at that in the report. Also mention that there's a set of 4 commentaries, various perspectives on early learning that are also kind of worth taking a look at. They get into and kind of tee up some kind of key issues or key debates that I think have been shaping and will continue to shape public discussion around early childhood. Okay, so that's the journalism in the report. Now we're going to change gears a little bit, and I'll just introduce a couple of the kind of main things we're going to talk about for the rest of the webinar today. Quality counts it's a fun project to work on as a researcher because you get to, not that we don't kind of work with the Education Newsroom on a regular basis, but we work really closely with them on the counts reports, and so it's kind of a fun project to work on every year. The focus changes, there's different ways you can tackle aspects of whatever the theme is with research and the journalism, and getting those to both kind of amplify one another in a way that I think is quite powerful. And so there's 2 main research kind of features in the report this year. One is tied to the early childhood theme. We did in the Research Center an analysis of kind of federal data on early childhood program. We look at participation rates, we look at trends over time, we look at gaps based on poverty in terms of kind of access and participation in early childhood programs. And you'll see some kind of pretty discrete data on that, and we also pull it together as part of an index that we score and grade the states on, the Early Education Index. We'll talk about that in a minute or two. And again, most people know quality counts over the years as the nation's report card on education, not NAEP. This is the other nation's report card on education of the state of the states. And if you follow the report over the years, you'll know that we've graded in quality counts in one way or another since its first issue in 1997. We've changed the framework over time. We've added new categories. We've kind of retired some. We've kind of tweaked the indicators we look at within particular graded categories to keep them relevant, fresh, and timely. You may recall last year we did not issue overall grades for the states. There are a couple of reasons for that. Last year we suspended our state policy survey, which we had been doing for a number of years, where we surveyed all the states on a handful of kind of key education policy issues. Our feeling around that, and we have been kind of had this on our minds for a couple of years before that, was quality counts really came about in the late 90s as a way to track really active period in state policymaking related to standards-based reform, standards, assessment, accountability, related teacher policies, and so forth. And over the almost 2 decades that the report's been around, just the nature of state policymaking and the policy environment and the kind of state of kind of evolution and maturity of the standards movement and those related policies has really changed. And so, our feeling was that the framework for policy that we have been using for a number of years had really run its course, and we hope kind of made a nice contribution to the field, both in bringing attention to important types of approaches and kind of how the states are tackling those. So we retired those 3 categories. I think it's entirely possible we'll return to do some state policy survey work in the future. We didn't do it this year, but it'll be kind of more targeted around kind of emergent issues or periodic, not annual, kind of checkups on what's going on in some really focal areas, whether it's kind of accountability or kind of teacher-related policies. And so that left us with kind of 3 other categories that are performance-related and get at the conditions that help support educational success. That's what we're grading on this year. And we'll get into details. There's chance for success, K-12 achievement, and there's school finance. And so that's what the grades are based on when we get to that point. And without any further ado, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn over the presentation to my colleague, Holly Reddick. I'll ask her to introduce herself and say a little bit about who she is. Many of you may know Holly from her prior gig. So.
Okay, so I am a former education reporter and went back to school and got a PhD in education policy. So that's sort of my backstory, as Lillian mentioned earlier. I am going to be talking about some of these trends that we saw as we got down into the nitty-gritty of analyzing the federal data related to our theme, which is early childhood education. And we found several interesting trends. The first one that I'm going to talk about is that younger children, it has to do with age. So the younger a child is, the less likely that child is to be enrolled in school, perhaps not so surprisingly. Most children between the ages of 3 and 6 are enrolled in school, 63%. But when you look at 3 and 4-year-olds, more than half of children that age are not in school. While if you look at 5 and 6-year-olds, only 8% of children that age are not in school. So there's a lot of variation by age that we found. The next trend that we saw related to participation in preschool by income. This is one that surprised me a little bit. You always sort of think of public programs as targeting, they often have targeted lower income families, but it turns out that actually lower income families are underrepresented in early childhood education. So while nearly 2/3 of 3 and 4-year-olds from families earning $100,000 a year or more are enrolled in preschool, just 40% of 3 and 4-year-olds from families earning less than $50,000 per year are enrolled in preschool. So that's a pretty big gap. Moving on to the next trend, this trend relates to ethnicity and race. For the most part, Asian, Black, and white children tend to be enrolled in preschool at similar rates. But that's a little different when you break it out by whether or not a child is Native American or Hispanic. Hispanics are not only our nation's largest minority group, but they are also the most likely to be underrepresented in preschool. So we see only 39% of Hispanics enrolled in preschool. A final trend that's really important to keep in mind as we go through all this data is that the private sector plays a much bigger role than in early childhood education than it does in K-12 education. So 40% of preschoolers are attending private programs. But when you look at first graders, that percentage drops to only 11% of first graders are enrolled in private programs. So, as we go through these, through our report, and we talk about our results, it's important to keep that in mind. I'm going to turn now to our Early Education Index, and this is a special new index that we created just for this year's report, or we created specifically for this year's report. And it was sort of our effort to make sense of some of the variation we saw, not only by some of the categories I just described, but at the state level. There are a lot of differences when you drill down to the state level and you look at early childhood education. This index is based on 8 key indicators: preschool enrollment, which is the percentage of 3 and 4-year-olds enrolled in preschool. And that information was drawn from the Census Bureau's American Community Survey. Preschool enrollment gains, so changes in that enrollment between 2008 and 2013. The preschool poverty gap, the current difference in preschool enrollment between children who are and are not from families within 200% of the poverty line. The preschool poverty gap change, which is the change in that poverty gap between 2008 and 2013. Full-day preschool enrollment. Full-day preschool enrollment is the percentage of preschoolers who were attending full-day preschool as reported by families who responded to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics Current Population Survey. We also looked at Head Start enrollment, since Head Start is sort of the nation's biggest public preschool program. It's a federal program that targets low-income and at-risk children. Head Start enrollment, we counted that as we calculated that as the percentage of Head Start students who are from families under the federal poverty line. We got the Head Start enrollment data from the Administration for Children and Families, which oversees Head Start, and then we got the poverty data from the Census Bureau. Our last two categories do delve a bit into the K through 12 world. We look at kindergarten enrollment and full-day kindergarten enrollment. You know, a caveat is that, again, this data comes from the census and not from the school districts. So this is from the Current Population Survey and the American Community Survey, and it's based on families' reports of whether or not their kindergarten-age children are enrolled in kindergarten and whether or not kindergartners are indeed enrolled in full-day kindergarten. So again, an important point to keep in mind is that, as you might have noticed, most of this data is drawn from federal surveys that ask families to self-report information. It's generally not from program schools or education agencies, but from families themselves. I'll go ahead and address a question that came up earlier, I think, from our moderator, and that is, one of the questions was, why is this data, you know, not necessarily from 2015, 2014? I would say we use the most recent available data from the census, and so that is what this represents. And in general, the data that just came out this fall was from 2013. So this is the absolute fresh, hot off the press, freshest, hottest off the press data on these indicators. I'm moving now to the results and the overall grade on the Early Childhood Education Index. The nation as a whole earned a D+ across the categories. The majority of the states, 29 of them, however, ranked in the top 10 for some and the bottom of 10 for others. So there's a lot of variety here in terms of how each state does. A state may do very well in one indicator and then find itself not doing so well in another indicator. And that's just because of some of that sort of you know, the sort of patchwork of laws and institutions that we see in early childhood. It's just simply a much less consistent world, less consistent landscape than K through 12. The absolute top state is the District of Columbia. The top jurisdiction is the District of Columbia. And the District of Columbia earned a B+, 89.5. By contrast, we have at the bottom Utah, which earned an F, one of two states that earned an F with a 56.7. And these numbers, just to make sure that everybody understands this, these numbers are all out of 100 points. I'm going to go ahead and break down some of these categories a little bit to give you a sense of some of the variety that we see. So in terms of enrollment, the average preschool enrollment, as you recall, was included in this index, was 47% in the nation as a whole. But that really varied a lot. For instance, in the District of Columbia, 76% of 3 and 4-year-olds are enrolled in preschool. And then we look at Nevada, and 31% of 3 and 4-year-olds are enrolled in preschool there. It's sort of a similar story with full-day enrollment. So the average is 49% of preschoolers are in full day programs, but that varied a lot too, from a high of 77.6% in Arkansas to a low of 51% in Utah. Again, the story is similar with Head Start. Participation rates varied quite a bit there. The average was 35.9% of 3 and 4-year-olds in poverty enrolled in Head Start, but that ranged from 88.3% in the District of Columbia to 51% in Nevada. I'm going to talk now about some changes over time, the changes over the past 5 years. Nationwide, enrollment rates have remained fairly flat overall for students. However, again, that varied by state. The percentage of 3 and 4-year-olds enrolled in preschool increased over 5 years, so 2008 to 2013. The percentage increased by 7 percentage points in Maine, and then at the other end of the spectrum, it decreased by as much as 5.2 percentage points in South Carolina. Turning to the poverty gap, again, we see a lot of variety by state. So the average national gap is 16 percentage points. So that's the difference between percentage of poor and non-poor children who are enrolled in preschool nationwide. But the state gaps are very different. So the gap can be as large as 29 points in Vermont. And then when you look at Montana and Wyoming, poor students are actually slightly more likely to be enrolled in preschool than non-poor students in most states. Nationwide, the preschool poverty gap has actually gotten slightly larger in the past decade, increasing by nearly 1 percentage point. I'm going to move now to our kindergarten indicators. Kindergarten, somewhat like preschool, operates in a policy and regulatory context that's distinct from the rest of elementary and secondary schooling. According to the Education Commission of the states, only 15 states and the District of Columbia actually require children to attend kindergarten. That said, we found that nationwide, most children in that age group, 5 and 6-year-olds, actually do attend kindergarten, 78%. And most of those children who are in kindergarten are in full-day programs. So 3/4 are in full-day programs. Again, we see variety or variation by state, a little bit less than we see with pre-K, but still some variation. For instance, kindergarten participation rates range from 83.9% in South Carolina to 67.6% in South Dakota. Similarly, there's variation in participation in full-day programs. 92.4% of children in Hawaii are enrolled in full-day programs as compared to just about 1/4 of children in Utah, which is the lowest participation rate in full-day kindergarten. I'm going to move now to our State of the States indicators. This is something that's separate from the Early Education Index. The Early Education Index is not part of these. The State of the States indicators are the indicators that if you followed this report before, you are probably at least somewhat familiar with. And these indicators track progress across 3 main areas of performance. These areas include this year a sort of, as Chris mentioned, a newer sort of streamlined set of indices. We have 3 of them. The first one is the Chance for Success Index. The second is our School Finance Analysis, which examines overall spending and also equity insofar as how funding is distributed among districts within a state. And then the final category is K-12 achievement. So I want to say one thing about this category that I know every year there are some people, so we only update K-12 achievement every other year. The reason is that this indicator depends very heavily on NAEP, National Assessment of Educational Progress scores, and these scores only come out every 2 years. So the last time we updated this category was 2014. Often, sort of misunderstanding sometimes and thinking that this is new. So they'll say something like, oh, my state, was, number 14 for the second year in a row. So I just want to emphasize that this is not new information this year. It's the same ranking as last year. However, it is included in our brand new summative grades. And our summative grades include all 3 categories. Overall this year on our summative grades, which we temporarily suspended last year and brought back this year, in this sort of newer streamlined form, the nation earns a C across all 3 performance categories. The majority of states earned overall grades between C- and C+, with Massachusetts, which is sort of a perennial top runner, earning the top score of B, or 86.2 out of 100 points. Again, all these point values you see are out of 100 points. At the other end of the spectrum, we have Mississippi earning a D, which is 64.2 points out of 100. Another caution is that I would be careful comparing grade to the last time we issued overall grades in 2013. I think the reason is that we don't have our 3 policy categories that we previously had. So it's sort of like, I would compare it to, like, in the first semester, you might have one set of tests and exams, helping to decide what grade you get. Second semester, you have the same teacher maybe, but a different set of tests and exams. So it's not necessarily comparable. It's not exactly an apples to oranges comparison. It's maybe like a Fiji apple to a Granny Smith apple comparison. But still, I would really hesitate to compare your state's previous grade to the way things are this year. Delving a little bit more deeply into one of our indicators, which is new this year, in terms of it's been updated this year. It's one of our legacy indicators. The Chance for Success Index captures the role of education from cradle to career, with 13 different indicators basically spanning sort of a child's very early years all the way through to adult outcomes. The national grade this year is a C+. This is the same as last year. However, when you look at the point breakdown, it's somewhat of a very tiny improvement. We have our top state, Massachusetts, and then we have our bottom state, which is Nevada. Our school finance analysis has also been updated this year. Again, also one of 3 parts of the summative grade, one of 3 equal parts, I should say. And school finance analysis, as I said before, looks at spending and equity. The national grade is a C. The top state is sort of perennial, or Wyoming, which has been a front runner for many years. Wyoming earned a B+, and the bottom state earning an F is Idaho. If you are very interested in school finance in your state, you might want to contact us to follow up. There have been some sort of small in the weeds changes to the way we calculated this indicator. You still should be able to compare it to previous years to last year, but there have been some small methodological changes that you might want to ask us about if you're wondering about that. Overall, school spending continues to decline. Again, this is the most recent data that we do have, which is from 2012. So, I think we can probably imagine that this is probably still the after effect of the recession. Our final index, which is the one we did not update this year, I will just sort of very quickly go into this one. This is the K through 12 Achievement Index, and this index assesses states on 18 indicators that capture current achievement, change over time, and poverty-based gaps, so equity. The national grade is C-. Again, we have Massachusetts at the top, and then the bottom state is Mississippi, with the District of Columbia also earning an F. I'd like to hand the microphone now back to Chris Swanson, who's going to wrap up the report and talk to you about some of the web-only and special features that we have for you.
Switching back just to wrap things up a little bit. So you have heard already, and you know we have lots of information available for you online. The place you're going to want to go to find all that is just the main landing page of the report, which you'll see there, www.edweek.org/go/QC2015. The site is under embargo until just after midnight Thursday. Like everything else we do, you'll find all the contents of the print edition of the paper, including quality count, which is a special issue of the paper, online. In addition to that, we've got a variety of web-only features. We have an interactive state report card tool, which will allow you to kind of browse the grading across the nation. We have a grading calculator that lets you kind of recalculate grades based on whatever weight you think as a user a category or particular subcategory should have, and that's kind of a fun tool. Also we have, and this will be especially important to folks with a kind of specific state focus to your reporting, we have for a number of years been doing state highlight reports, and what these reports do is they take basically the bulk of the data from the report, which you'll see in the print report in big 50 state tables, and kind of repackages the data so you can see in really kind of clear way your own state's story, kind of how they stand on the grading and the specific indicators that make up the grading, and then it puts that in a national context and gives you the kind of national average and other useful comparisons. So you'll find lots of detailed information on our state of the state's grading, as well as information on the early education index and some analysis of the early childhood data that was included in the report. So you'll see the URL for those there. You can also find a link for those on the main quality counts page. And if you really like data and kind of crunching your own, we have the Education Counts database. That is an online database that we've been doing for years now, which houses almost 2 decades worth of state-level data that we've collected and created as part of quality counts and our other counts reports, technology counts and diplomas count. And so that lets you kind of go back in time, lets you create some tables and some other tools like that. So if you're interested in raw data, that's the place you want to go, especially for prior years. So that's about it from here. I just want to kind of thank Holly and our other colleagues who in the Research Center who worked on the report. You'll see their names there. In addition to the editors and reporters in the newsroom who really kind of put together a fantastic journalistic package for the report this year. If you need to get in touch with us, we're looking forward to your questions now. If you need to get in touch with us offline after the webinar, the best way is that email you see down there. It's rcinfo@epe.org. That's a group email, and so there's a number of our staffers keeping an eye on that so we can respond as quickly as possible. Another way you can get in touch with us is at 301-280-3100. That's the main Education Week switchboard, and they can direct you to the Research Center. We can answer your questions from there. So that is it for me. I'll turn it back over to Lillian.
Okay, great. Thank you both. Excuse me. I'm getting over a cold, so excuse all the tea I've been drinking while listening here. So we have some questions coming in. I encourage you now to send in more questions. Now's the time. I have a few of my own. Betsy Hammond from the Oregonian has sent in a few, and we are waiting for more. Otherwise, you're just going to have to listen to me and Betsy ask our questions. So my first question, you guys addressed one of the questions we spoke about earlier about why some of the numbers seem older, so thank you for talking about that. I guess one question I have, especially on the early ed side, is what measures, there's a lot of different measures you have on the early ed index. Which ones would you recommend reporters pay the most attention to in their own state as they're trying to get a sense of, where they are and where they might be going?
Chris, would you like me to answer that? Would you like to answer it?
Go ahead.
Okay. I think a good place to start is just looking at the overall preschool enrollment. That's one where we see a lot of variety. The overall kindergarten enrollment is interesting, but a little bit less variety there by state. That's just a good basic place to start. But it's sort of a carefully curated selection of indicators, and so I would say pay attention to all of them. They're all sort of interesting, in their own right. Head Start is important because it's our main, our sort of main preschool program for kids, low-income kids. If you care about equity, the gap is important. The change over time, to me, that was something that was interesting to me because I sort of had this impression, given the sort of what the political rhetoric, that perhaps preschool enrollment was increasing and increasing and increasing, and then it actually has not increased, and the gap has actually, the overall enrollment has not increased, and the poverty gap has actually gotten a little bit bigger. So, I would say start with just the enrollment snapshot, and then go from there and see what's interesting in your state.
Yeah, and I think partly there may be particular kind of issues in the early childhood preschool domain that are especially salient or kind of very live politically in different states, and so each of you out there on the webinar would know what those are in your own state. I think this is a kind of set of indicators that was put together to be manageable, but kind of give you as full a view as you can with just 8 data points per state. That's there's dozens you could potentially look at. When we put together these 50 state analyses for the counts reports, it's very important for us to actually have reliable data for all 50 states. And so unless there's a really compelling reason why that's not available, or for some reason a state is not applicable, and in the finance analysis in the other part of the report you'll see kind of notes that we can't do equity grades on finance for DC and Hawaii because they're single district jurisdictions, right? And that looks at distribution of funding across districts. So so they're meant to kind of give a good kind of quick, well-rounded view. There's maybe the way I think about it, at least in the way we constructed this, there's a little bit of narrative to tell you. Start with the basics, maybe kind of what are the preschool enrollment rates. Some logical next questions are, have these changed over time? Are all students equally able to participate in preschool? And that's where you kind of get into the poverty gaps. And so there's that kind of preschool, that kind of age 3 and 4, and we've got a cluster of kind of kindergarten indicators. And again, you start with what's the basic kind of participation rate in kindergarten. And it surprises a lot of people still, although we've been reporting on this for a number of years now, that the kindergarten participation rate is not in fact 100%, right? So kind of absenteeism aside, you assume that school age kids, at least starting at first grade, everybody should be in school, right? At least kind of during the kind of mandatory, education years. But kindergarten, it just does not work quite the same way. Most, if not virtually all of the states have law on the books that requires districts to provide kindergarten programs, but there's only I think about a dozen to 15 states that actually require kindergarten age kids to attend kindergarten. So you've got the distinction that I think is not real well known and sometimes lost between providing the service and kind of requiring students to participate in it. And so there's some interesting twists in kindergarten. And of course, one of the big issues at the kindergarten level is the kind of part day versus kind of full day. And you'll see kind of that in the indicators as well. So again, would encourage you all to dig in, figure out what's most important for the own story being yourself.
Yeah,
okay, great.
Just to add one thing to that, one thing I should also mention is, and we got this question from other people, this analysis includes public and private participation in this preschool analysis. So, that because it surveys of parents are able to say whether it's public or what, they're included whether or not their children are in public or in private. So I sort of am anticipating that that's a question that might come up about that index that I wanted to make clear.
Great, thank you. Well, I know I have lots of other questions, but we've got some rolling in from our folks attending on the webinar right now, so I'm going to go to those. But really briefly, I just want to highly recommend Christina Samuel's article, which is part of this package. It's the title is Consensus, Just the Starting Point on Early Ed, and it's a really great sort of narrative look at both this data and people she's talked to across the country about where things are coming. I read that as a report. I highly recommend taking a look. Okay, our first question is from Betsy Hammond of the Oregonian. She has a really specific question here, so I'm going to read it verbatim. The early childhood statistics that come from ACS data, are those error bands sufficiently narrow to rank states on things such as the percent of low income versus not low income students in preschool over time? She wants to know if there's a meaningful difference between a state ranked 29 or 34, for example.
I think that's a good question, and this is actually a challenge that we have encountered in other projects as well when you look at a very kind of narrow age band, whether it's a couple years or kind of a year, what would correspond to a year in school. American Community Survey, if kind of folks aren't familiar with it, it's a fantastic data resource. It's what has replaced the long form of the decennial census, and so it's kind of got that kind of very broad scope. It's done every year. It gets kind of captures about 3 million people a year. But even at that sort of scale, when you kind of narrow it down to a very narrow age band and state-specific information, you need to be careful. And so what we've done for a lot of this analysis is to pool data over multiple years. That gives us kind of bigger numbers. It kind of gives us kind of more solid estimates, results. One kind of downside of that is you are kind of combining data over a couple years, where they may be kind of trending within that period, and that's just that's the trade-off you make for something like this. So when we did this analysis, we were really careful to look to make sure there's enough raw cases in the database to kind of stand behind, and that is the case here. That being said, you do get fluctuations just even with kind of larger populations from year to year, and that's just the natural property of this. Whether there is a kind of meaningful distinction between a state that's kind of ranked 29th versus 30th or 31st or whatever, the unsatisfying answer to that is sometimes, but sometimes not. And what you tend to see is a lot of these distributions are kind of bell curve shaped. And so you get a lot of people clumped in the middle, and kind of rank differences when you're in that big middle clump don't mean as much as they do on the ends, where you may get kind of some more differentiation. If we wanted to, and we do not for the counts report, you could do things like test of statistical significance that would let you know whether this value is significantly different than this value, and some of you may be familiar with that from reporting on NAEP or some other databases. We don't do that in this report just because it's a level of kind of technical, kind of methodological complexity that doesn't necessarily, we think, add a whole lot to the story and is not of interest to a lot of our readership, although it is some. So we're not doing that in this report.
Okay, great, thank you. This next question is from Sonali Kohli from Quartz. She has a very reporter question here, and I think it is one that comes up a lot. So she wants to know, is there a difference between preschool and pre-kindergarten? And did you make a differentiation in your data between those two things, if they're different, and if they're different, how? We see both terms, so which one should we be using?
So so we use those terms interchangeably. The data sources that we used did ask people specifically to if their children were enrolled in, I think, preschool, nursery school, or any sort of school that a program that leads. Basically, people are the census tries to distinguish between the best as they can to help people distinguish between preschool and daycare. And so the people are sort of asked, is your child in a school that could potentially lead to a degree? I mean, I don't know how meaningful that is necessarily for young kids. But one thing to keep in mind with this is that these are self-reports from families, and so it's certainly very possible that some of the families have their kids in daycare and they're saying they're in preschool, and some of the families have their kids in preschool and say think of it as a daycare. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. But as for whether we use pre-K and preschool to mean different things, no, those are just in the language of our report. Those are the same word.
Okay, great, thank you. Next question is from Ann Schmieke. I'm sorry, Ann, I probably butchered your last name. She's from Chalk Beat, Colorado. And her first question is the early education index for this year only, or will it be included in future quality counts reports?
That's something we did specifically for this year's report. Whether we might do it in the future or not, we don't know. But it was intended to be for this year's report.
Okay. Next question is from Kathy Kandinsky from the Columbus Dispatch. With so much ed reform happening in Ohio and other states like Common Core, the reading guarantees, when might we see some improvement in report card indicators? And are you surprised by seemingly flat performances nationwide?
I think it's sometimes a little frustrating as kind of somebody who cares about education, not just professionally, but kind of personally, that things can move as slowly as they sometimes do, or almost always do. And so, especially when we look at kind of performance categories, whether it's tested achievement or graduation rates or college entrance exam performance, things like that, especially at state and especially at national level, things can move pretty slowly, and what might be in kind of reality and on the ground some really meaningful change may just look like a little blip kind of when you look at the data. And so that's, I think that's just kind of the name of the game a little bit. That being said, I think that speaks to the importance of kind of following and keeping focus on these issues over longer periods of time. You know, as journalists, you were the kind of folks being able to do that for the kind of your readership and your audience. Um, and I think, unfortunately, I think public attention cycles and kind of policymakers' attention kind of varies and kind of goes in cycles. And so one of the things that's been, we think is important in the contribution of accounts reports is that it has been kind of a drumbeat on these issues for the better part of 20 years now that gets people to kind of focus on, okay, here's where we are, kind of here's where we've come. And we don't do a whole lot of retrospection in quality accounts, although we occasionally do, in terms of, our, say, the policies that we look at or kind of the themes we focus on. Can you make a strong case that they are kind of driving measurable changes and improvement? Although we did do that actually around the time of the 10th anniversary of the report. And we found some, kind of evidence to suggest that, some of these, kind of state-level policy strategies that the report had been tracking were associated with, gains in achievement over time. That's not to say this is causality with a big C, but, the trend was pretty evident in the data. But the other thing that I think that gave us an appreciation for was that when you do take, the longer view, say a decade or so, then you really do see what are, in some cases, some really meaningful changes and some really interesting stories of improvement. And the example that I'll often use, and it comes out of that particular analysis we did, is if you look at Florida. Right, Florida is a state that we talk about a lot in the policy context, especially, kind of in the earlier part of the past decade. It's a state that, if you go back, 15, 20 years, was a relatively lower performing state. It got very aggressive in terms of state policy. It was really on board with standards, assessment, accountability, that whole standards-based reform package. And over a period of about a decade, it moved from kind of the lower end of the pack to about the national average, and in some areas, higher than that. That's a story that took, 10, 15 years to unfold. And so when we go in, kind of, what's happened since last year, what's happened, we're not going to see big changes. And if we do, as a researcher, you say, uh-oh, what's wrong with the data, right? Because a lot of these things you don't expect to
change too fast. Okay, interesting. All right, folks, we've got about 5 more minutes. So if you have more questions, please do feel free to send them in. I will try to ask as many as we can get in. This is another question from Sonali Kohli with Quartz. She wants to know if you've also examined how national preschool enrollment in the United States compares to other countries. Is that something you've looked at all?
No, not for this report, but that would be a very interesting thing to examine.
I agree. You should look at it. Okay, I have a question also. So we talked a little bit about where this report's going in the future and that, things change slowly. Will quality counts be using PARCC and SBAC test scores next year or the following year as part of its report card?
That's a good question. We don't have plans to do that now. And one of the issues with that is just our kind of general consideration of having complete and consistent 50-state information. And so if we look at the consortium test, let's assume in a perfect world all the states are in a consortium, and we know that's not the case. But even if they were, you'd have two different assessment frameworks that were not designed to necessarily be real consistent with one another. So you have kind of psychometric issues about kind of how you would equate scores in a smarter balanced state with a PARCC state. And there's a similar kind of situation that we've looked at closely, and we see that at the end of high school. So one of the big frustrations as a researcher and somebody who does 50-state stuff is that we don't have a kind of good representative general population measure of late high school achievement for states, right? So we've got the national NAEP at the 12th grade, but there's no state level mandatory NAEP at the 12th grade. So that's a real kind of black hole in my mind. What we've looked at as a possible alternative to that is college entrance exams, so the ACT and the SAT. You have a couple of issues there. It's not universally given, right? You have to decide to go and take it, although kind of participation rates are up, from historical levels. But then you've got kind of two different, tests that are being given at different parts of the country. So they're not, consistently scaled with one another for starters. And then you have the aside from the selectivity issue, then we've got kind of regional differences that are tied up in kind of, different parts of the country take those exams. So we'll definitely be keeping an eye, both kind of from a news perspective and kind of from a research perspective on kind of how those assessments and the results unfold. We don't have plans right now to use them as part of our grading.
Okay. Very practical question here from Betsy Hammond of the Oregonian. She wants to know if we want to embed links directly to specific elements of EdWeek's report, for example, a direct link to our state highlights report, how can we do that before midnight tonight?
That depends on your kind of production process. And so the main thing just is to kind of hold off publishing anything until after midnight tonight.
But will the URL be the same as the embargoed one?
Yes, it will. So this is like the worst kept secret, right? And so the URLs that you see now are the same URLs that will be in effect after the embargo.
Okay. So we can put them in our draft, and then when we hit publish, and they'll become public after midnight. That'll work. That'll work.
Yeah, and Betsy, that's also midnight Eastern time, so you guys can publish earlier.
Betsy, you can publish at 9 p.m. I'm sure you're still working then. You're good to go. Okay, great. Let's see. I don't have any. I have some new questions. Here's another question from Sonali Kohli with Quartz. Are there any reasons that children from lower income households are attending preschool less? And might the differences be connected with the fact that preschools are more private than other grades?
Yes.
Yeah, definitely.
Definitely. You get kind of higher levels of, kind of private sector participation in kind of preschool versus K-12, and you have to pay for those. And so I think that's kind of very much at the heart of this. One kind of interesting side note, when you kind of look at the early childhood index, especially kind of the change over time, one important kind of piece of context to kind of think about when you kind of interpret and kind of make sense of the results is we're looking at a period of time from 2008 to 2013 when we're looking at changes in those indicators. What's right in the middle of that is kind of the recession and the recovery. And so we're catching the country at a particular point in time, we're catching up to it at a later point in time. And a lot of change, during that period with respect to employment, income levels, whether a kind of parent is out of work and at home and able to kind of watch kids at home, which might not have been the case before the recession. So there's some really interesting kind of complexity with that time period, especially as it relates to the early childhood kind of preschool age range.
Okay, great. Well, it's 11 o'clock. I want to get into this one last question from Betsy, but if someone could take it quickly, that'd be great. It's a good question, though I don't want to leave it on the table. She says, you give the gap in preschool enrollment rates for poor and non-poor, but not the underlying rates for various states. Is it possible to get the state rates for preschool enrollment for poor versus non-poor?
Yeah, if you send an email to the rcinfo@epe.org email address, we can get you those kind of specific pieces of underlying information. We've got those.
Oh, great. I'm glad I asked that question. Okay, that's all I have for now. Did either of you have anything else you wanted to make sure you said?
No, just kind of thanks a lot. I appreciate EWA kind of hosting this, and Lillian, for you for moderating and for all the questions. And again, if you do have kind of questions offline, anyone, just let us know, rcinfo@epe.org.
Okay, Chris and Holly, thank you very much.
I would just echo Chris.
Yes.
No, I just said I would echo Chris in saying thanks to everyone for participating.
Thanks. Sorry, there's a little bit of a delay, so thanks for awkward talking over each other. All right, that's it, everybody. Thanks for attending, and hopefully you'll be at the next EWA webinar.